I'm Logan Gilefsky,
And I'm Sheth.
and we did our project on limits on free speech.
The first limit on free speech is speech that deals with national security. And people often debate if the protections granted to the American citizens under the First Amendment extend to matters of national security. But generally, any speech that could harm the American government or its people is not protected under the First Amendment. The first example of this would be the Alien and Sedition Acts, which obviously stopped the criticization of the president by the press. Another example of this would be Sheth versus the United States, which put into play the clear and present danger clause. And then this precedent was also strengthened by cases like Gitlow versus New York. However, since these cases, rulings have largely been related to the tension levels at the time. For example, Dennis versus the United States and Branberg versus Ohio essentially made the opposite ruling of Sheth versus the United States, and in a kind of sense overruled the previously mentioned case. The second type of speech that is not protected under the First Amendment would be obscenity. It's not really a debate. Obscenity has never been protected under the Constitution, but what has been a debate is what exactly qualifies as obscene material. So the modern precedent for this was set by the case of Miller versus California, which took place in 1957, and the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that obscene speech is any material that lacks serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific value. And then this ruling also led to the implementation of the Miller test, which is essentially a three-part judicial test that helps determine if a material is obscene and should be banned by the American government. And then obviously debates about censorship and obscenity have always kind of been a part of American history, and debates are still ongoing today.
Okay, the third type of limit on free speech is libel and slander. Libel being written untruth and slander being verbal untruth. The key here is that for libel and slander, it must be a false statement presented as a fact. And the other important thing to know is that cases involving private figures and public figures are treated differently in the law. For private figures, being like ordinary citizens, the burden of proof is to demonstrate negligence, which is a failure to act with the degree of care that a reasonable person would take when publishing the statement. This is a much lower bar compared to public figures, where the burden of proof is to demonstrate actual malice. Actual malice is proof that the defendant either fully knew a statement was false or seriously doubted its legitimacy, yet still published it anyway. And as you can see, that's a much higher bar. And the important Supreme Court case to know for libel and slander is the New York Times Company versus Sullivan in 1964, which established the actual malice standard. Finally, the fourth limit on free speech is symbolic speech, being non-verbal communication that expresses ideas or messages. Examples of these include flag burning, armbands, protests, and there's many other examples. It's a very broad category. These symbolic speech are generally protected unless the symbolic speech establishes a substantial disruption or invades the rights of others. And the important Supreme Court cases here are Tinker v. Des Moines in 1969, where students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and the Supreme Court sided with the students that symbolic speech was protected by the First Amendment because it did not substantially disrupt the learning environment. The other Supreme Court case to know is Texas v. Johnson in 1989, where Johnson burned an American flag as a political demonstration. Again, the Supreme Court sided with Johnson, arguing that flag burning was still protected, even though it was offensive or unpopular. And from both of these Supreme Court cases, you can see that the Supreme Court chose to side with the defendant and free speech more often than limiting the free speech, but seeing as there are limits, that's why it's